Hello everyone. This video is actually going to be separated into two different videos. This first video is going to be solely discussing who Geoffrey Chaucer was and a little bit of history at the time that the Canterbury Tales was written. And then the second video is going to focus on the Canterbury Tales itself, the stories themselves. So let's get started. So just kind of for your understanding before we really get into it, the textbook that you have provides the Middle English version of the text. However, I have posted a link to Harvard where they have translated the Middle English to Modern English. So if you see here, let me pull up my pen. If you see here, these darker lines, those are the Middle English words that Chaucer actually wrote. So, Juan d'April with his shoulders solta. That's what Chaucer wrote. But Harvard has pretty much translated all of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So, these lines underneath the bolded lines, that is the modern version of what Chaucer wrote. So Juan d'April with his shoulders solta turns into an April with its sweet smelling showers. So that's a lot easier to understand. I would encourage you to, instead of using your book, to click on the Harvard links that I've posted and read through the Canterbury Tales from Harvard's website. So, who is Geoffrey Chaucer? Well, Geoffrey Chaucer is a pretty interesting person because we are, talking about a time when money mattered. And you either had money or you didn't. You were either upper class or you were a peasant. And Chaucer kind of defied both of those rules. He was, kind of a middle class. He was not noble, so he was not, he was not a duke. He was not royalty. But he was not poor either. He had a skilled job, so he was a civil servant. So basically, he worked for the government. He served Edward III and he served Richard II. So, he worked for the government. He knew a lot of very important people, but he was not one of those important people himself. His granddaughter did marry nobility, so his family does come into money and power later on, but he himself did not. He was not very rich or powerful, but he was well known. Everybody knew who he was. He wasn't really popular for his writing when he was alive. People didn't start reading Chaucer's writing until after he died, which is the case for so many other artists and authors. But, he did know a lot of different languages. So he gained inspiration from Petrarch, who was an Italian poet. So he knew Italian. Boccaccio is another Italian poet that he pulled inspiration from. So he was fluent in Italian, but he also loved ancient Roman poets. And ancient Roman poets wrote in Latin. So he was also fluent in Latin. And as we know from previous videos, Latin was the language of the learned. He was, an academic. So he was very intelligent, and he drew inspiration from his studies. So let's talk about a little bit of history when all of this is going on. So we're looking at 1340 to 1400. And there is a lot of terrible things going on in the world at this time. So the biggest thing we have going on is the Black Death or the bubonic plague. So we'll talk about that in a little bit of detail here in just a few minutes. We've got a lot of church corruption, and church corruption has been going on long before 1340, but the general public are learning about that church corruption during this period. And both of these things lead to some substantial political unrest. Now, uh, you know, the time period that we're looking at right now is right before the Renaissance is really taking over. So the Renaissance is in the early stages in Italy right now. And so the Renaissance and this new way of thinking is coming to England, but we're not there yet. So let's talk about the bubonic plague in a little more detail. Let's see. All right, so the bubonic plague, it broke out in the 1330s, and it came from China. So the way that the bubonic plague kind of overtook the world, we don't, as humans, know a lot about disease control at this point. We don't understand that washing our hands or covering our mouths when we cough, we don't quite understand that those are disease control methods. So the bubonic plague, it mainly affected rodents, so rats. So fleas would get on these rats that were infected with this plague. And then the fleas would bite the rats, and then the fleas would get the disease. And because we don't have a lot of pest control, you couldn't call cooks pest control back then. Fleas would then, jump to people and then bite people, and the plague has started. And the plague, once it got people infected, it was contagious. It was very contagious, and it spread rapidly. So the plague itself caused fever, swelling of the lymph glands. So it's called the bubonic plague because lymph glands are called buboes. So that's where bubonic came from. And it also caused spots on the skin that were red, and then those spots would turn black. And it was just a very terrible disease. The Italian writer Boccaccio, that Chaucer gained inspiration from, he said that many people would eat lunch with their friends and eat dinner with their ancestors in paradise. So it was a very quick death. About a third of Europe's population died during the bubonic plague. So we're talking about 25 million people in the span of 5 years died, and that was a third of Europe's population. So something that I want you to kind of understand is the disease started in China, and China was and still is, a huge trading port. They would ship supplies, goods all over the world from their trading ports. So when medicine isn't really good, basically doctors at this point were just kind of guessing. When you don't know how diseases are spread or how to stop them, you don't have medicine to combat fevers, you don't have antibiotics to, take care of infections. When medicine just isn't developed enough to know how to handle a disease like this, and you have a trading port like China that is, sending things all over the world, well, China's also sending this disease all over the world. So what happened is this disease kind of created a labor shortage, because think about it. The people who were contracting the disease and were dying from the disease were people who could not afford to leave the country and go somewhere where the disease had not spread. So they were the poorer people, those who worked those labor jobs. And so what happened, and part of what led to this political unrest, is that there were no workers. So laborers were in high demand. There was nobody to work. And what the laborers who were left realized is, hey, there's not many of us willing to do this work that needs to be done. We should ask for higher wages. And if you know anything about what's happening now in our political climate in America, that's kind of what's happening now. We've had this huge pandemic. Now our labor force, it's not that our labor force has perished, they're not dead, but the same kind of mentality is going on. We have a labor shortage. Not a lot of people are trying to get these jobs, these lower paying jobs, and it's because laborers have realized, hey, if nobody will do this work for such a low amount of money, then they'll have to start paying better wages. So that's kind of what happened, and that led to several peasant uprisings. So in 1381, there were some burning of palaces. We'll talk about the beheading of the Archbishop Canterbury in just a second. But there was a lot of peasant uprisings because labor workers were realizing that they deserved to be paid a lot more, especially since so many of the labor force had died in the plague. Another thing that is happening at this time is this church corruption. So the church is taxing a lot of people, pretty much everyone. The church needs to tax people because they need money to help keep up with, to help maintain the grounds at the churches, to help maintain the churches themselves. So they're taxing everyone. But then there's also this idea that English churches are a long way from Rome. So the head of the Roman Catholic Church is in Rome, in Vatican City, and that's where the Pope is, and England is a long way from that. So there was this idea created that, that's not how we do things in England kind of mentality. And this distance from Rome kind of led to the Reformation. So the Reformation, when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in Germany, detailing all of the terrible things that the Catholic Church was doing, and that kind of led to the Reformation and this split between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. So a lot of things are happening with church corruption, and it all started because in the Black Death, people were, praying for the plague to go away. They were praying for people not to die. They were praying for a cure. They were praying for the disease to just kind of vanish. And when their prayers weren't being answered, they looked to the church wanting to know, why? Why are my prayers not being answered? I've done all of these things for the church. Why is the church not getting rid of this plague? And what happened is they realized the indulgences. Oh, let me go back. They were realizing the indulgences and the immorality that the church was kind of experiencing. So indulgences, what that means is the church would sell trinkets. Maybe it was, the bone of a squirrel leg, and they would tell people that it was the finger of a saint. Or they would sell a jewel and say that a saint kissed the jewel. And they would sell these trinkets to people, and they would tell people that if they bought these trinkets, that it would be like a ticket to heaven. They were absolutely guaranteed to go to heaven if they bought these things from the church. And that sounds ridiculous today, but if you think about it, everyone around these people, they were dying. They were dying horribly and they were dying quickly. So the church was offering them a guarantee that when these people died, they were going to spend whatever afterlife there was in a good place. So, these people were purchasing their salvations, so to speak. People were also kind of starting to realize the immorality of the clergy. So, what I mean by immorality is, the nuns and the monks, the priests, they took an oath of chastity, which means no sexual contact with anyone. And they took an oath of frugality, which means, no money. They were supposed to be poor. And that wasn't the case. People started to realize that the nuns and the monks and the priests, they were having sexual relations with people. They were taking this tax money and this indulgence money from people, and they were living a fairly lavish lifestyle. So the clergy wasn't following the rules that they told everybody else they had to follow. So that led to a little bit of unrest in the church. And then this dude, Wycliffe, he decided that there was an over-reliance on church officials. So at this time, the Bible was written in Latin. And if you remember from, Caedmon's Hymn and Bede and Dream of the Rood, only the church officials could read Latin because they were the academics. So what has happened is the Bible is written in Latin, and the only people who can read Latin are the church officials, the priests and the monks. And so everybody else, the common people, just had to trust the church officials that they were telling them the truth, that what they said that the Bible said was what the Bible actually said. They just had to kind of trust them. And Wycliffe said, that might not be the best idea. If they're selling tickets to heaven and they're not supposed to have sex and they're not supposed to have money, but they do, then what's to stop them from lying to us about what the Bible actually says? So he decided to translate the Bible into English for the common people. He thought if the common people were going to spend their money in church, then the common people needed access to what the Bible said. So he did translate the Bible, and this is kind of where our version of the Bible today stems from. He did translate the Bible, but he was killed for it. They did murder Wycliffe for the translating the Bible to English because it took power away from the church. At this point, the church is the most powerful entity in the land. It's, dare I say, even more powerful than the kings, because even the kings sometimes could not read, and even if they could read, they did not know Latin. So they relied on church officials to translate the Latin Bible for them as well. So you've got this over-reliance on the church, and that makes the church very, very powerful. And Wycliffe took that power away from the church by translating the Bible into English. So he was killed for that. And that leads us to the Canterbury Tales. So check out video 2 for the lecture about the Canterbury Tales itself.